Welcome to another episode of EMF Warriors, a podcast where we share the latest research and cutting-edge information on everything to do with electromagnetic fields. Solution-focused interviews, including genuine real-life stories of people affected by harmful EMFs and how they have fully recovered from their debilitating symptoms. So sit back, relax, and get ready to enjoy another episode of EMF Warriors.
Now, cryptocurrencies are being prototyped around the world. There's like 1,400 different cryptocurrencies out there at the moment. What I feel is going on is they're all being prototyped so the central banks and the governments of the world can bring out their own currencies, their own cryptocurrencies. And people don't want to believe this, but Australia, our home country, is leading the way in this digital cash revolution, and no one knows about it. There's a new website called New Payments Platform. It's www.nppa.com.au. And it is basically all the major banks and the RBA, that's our Federal Reserve, the Reserve Bank of Australia, our central bank, are all getting together and doing these new digital cash platforms. And you'll be given a pay ID, so it's kind of like an Australian card number, which is going to be your banking number, your social security number, your Medicare number, anything to do with the government is pay ID, and we're going to be able to do whatever we want, like instant transfers using the blockchain, and eventually they'll bring out a digital coin, which they're not talking about. The regulations have already been written. You can go to that website and you can read the regulations. So governments around the world, Australia kind of is one of the test cases for this stuff, particularly for the Anglo-American world, are using this system. Australians listening to this podcast will get a phone call or get an email from their bank in the next 1 year, maybe less, for their pay ID number. And they're going to force us all onto this centralized crypto blockchain system in which you have total control. So if they want to get me for speaking out on EMF or some other controversial issues, someone might want to speak out on vaccines or say something that they're not happy with the government, they just cut you off. Bang, you just lost everything. So it's kind of a complete control system that's coming. Then they have the surveillance with all these sensors. All those sensors are collecting information, and that information is going to a central point. Who runs it, I don't know, whether it's the Electricity Commission, whether they feed it onto the military or to ASIO and all the CIA, et cetera, I don't know. But the governments want this 5G bandwidth to bring in complete control. So I just want to mention that so people understand the bigger picture on what's coming. Go to nppa.com.au. You can have a look what's coming on the digital cash side of things. And it's all in timing with the rollout of 5G. So they're predicting like a 2021 rollout of this digital cash system. And Jim, you probably know that most of the telcos are nearly completed all their trials for 5G or the process of completing it.
So I can't comment too much on the cryptocurrencies because I just don't know about that.
Let's get on to 5G rollout. But
yeah, we'll talk about the 5G rollout. So we're kind of in the test and trial pre-standard period. This year, last year, this year, there is some trial networks being launched. So the Winter Olympics in South Korea, they're going to. So Samsung, I believe, is going to launch 5G. So it'll be functional. They'll design it to the current emission standard, and it'll be working. It'll be kind of like the 5.1G. So with all these different generations, there's in between the generations, there was 3.5G. That basically add features and increase the speeds within that generation. So using the same network, they kind of make improvements. That's what's going to happen with 5G too. So the sort of standards are kind of being finalized this year. So it's still in the standardization phase, both for the actual equipment itself and also the safety side of it. Now, what they're generally doing now is they're using the current below 6 gigahertz bands for 5G, for these sort of trial deployments, they're also using the higher 28 gig, usually about 28 gig or so, depending on which country. These low to mid bands, so below 1 gig up to 6 gigahertz. There'll be a limited use of these 24 gig band, these much higher bands. Now, remembering the macro, so this wider network that you currently see with towers or poles and those panel antenna looking things on them, that's called the macro network. That's the overall coverage. It'll provide coverage everywhere. Now it's more the infilling between, to provide those greater speeds, greater capacity. So that's kind of what's going to get tacked on afterwards.
In Australia, we've got the Commonwealth Games this year.
Yeah.
And that's where some major trials are happening locally, right?
That's right, yeah. So that's been officially announced. I think Optus and Telstra, they're both going to do 5G there, basically trial, because there's no device. Customers don't have devices either. So the customer ends, your current device is probably only up to 4G, the latest incarnation of 4G. They'll probably release maybe mobile broadband modems. They'll probably give it to the media as well, that sort of thing. Now, that's currently being manufactured as well, the actual devices that'll connect to this network, because the greater processing, because you're talking much greater speeds, they need to miniaturize it and make it smaller. Usually, the first thing they release is some sort of modem that's kind of bigger. Eventually gets put into some sort of phone. So I don't think you'll see phones this year. They'll come through later in the year. So for these games, you'll just see kind of like broadband devices, and they'll be showing them off. Look at these speeds, that kind of thing.
So let's say 2019, Apple and Samsung and all the providers start bringing out devices which you could pick up 5G bands. The telcos around the world will start activating these small cells to allow these devices to work.
Yeah. So I'll just mention that. So what you're going to see is currently you have a network that's sort of a patchwork, or they call it a cellular network, literally cells, footprints in the metro areas, 2 to 5 kilometers, roughly, depending on the area. If you get into the country or in the remote areas, they expand, the power goes up from the base station and increases the footprint to say 20, 30, 40 kilometers, depending on how remote it is. So because it's a shared spectrum, you want to have a small footprint because you have user density in the cities. What's going to happen is there's the wider coverage, which is provided by the existing network. They'll be upgraded to 5G, and they'll be using those lower bands for that the umbrella kind of coverage. Mm-hmm. And because the wavelength's smaller, the actual antenna's size can be much smaller.
And what are they going to look like, these small cells? Are they going to be like an attachment to a light pole?
So what you'll find is the antennas, so on the macro coverage, the wider area coverage, for 5G as well, that uses below 6 gigahertz, they will look very similar to the current antennas that you see on towers. Internally, they'll be different. So they'll just have, and that's what's happened over the generations. If you look at the old antennas, if you open them up, the amount of elements in them was a lot less. And then as you had 3G, the actual density inside the antenna itself of the radiating elements increased. And and there's the antenna design, they've improved it because there's all sorts of stuff that goes on inside there.
So they're going to retrofit the existing towers with 5G.
What usually happens is they shut. So a step is usually to shut down one of the oldest technologies. So we had GSM 2G for a long time. That was shut down last year. Pretty much all the telcos have done it, I believe, now, and that frees up capacity on the actual towers or structures themselves. It frees up, and generally these are old antennas. They'll swap them out. They'll put new ones in. They look about the same sort of footprint because they're once again using similar sort of frequencies, and also gives them capacity in terms of the actual exposure limit. So if you're up to whatever percentage of the exposure limit, and the telcos will tell you that we're only in the 1 or 2% of the whole limit or less. Now we're getting towards into the 1 or 2%, whatever. It kind of frees that up a bit more. So it gives you a bit more capacity in that regard as well.
So you're going to shut down 3G to put 5G in? Is that what you're saying?
No. So what you'll see is initially 3G will run alongside 4G and 5G as well.
Okay.
And mostly because there's still plenty of devices out there that use 3G only. The people haven't upgraded. Eventually, yes. And this is what the telcos do look at too. They look at the usage because they can tell all the handsets that can talk to the network, and they can kind of go, what percentage of handsets is still 3G? Oh, this percentage. Well, we won't turn it off yet. Or we'll put out an advertising campaign to tell people move on to the newer handsets. So
what? Just to interrupt a little bit. We tell all EMF warriors just to use 3G on their phones, not to use 4G. So if we all keep using 3G, you'll never turn it off. Is that what you're telling me?
No, but you'll still have 5G, 4G and 5G on top.
But if I just put 5G and disconnect 4G like I do now on my phone, and I won't get a new phone. I won't be getting a 5G phone because I don't need one.
4G will be around for a while. I'll tell you that.
What about 3G?
3G will be shut down in the following, in the early 2020s.
Oh.
In the early roaring 20s, it'll be probably shut down.
That's no good because 3G is one of the few kind of mobile frequencies that
they sell them these pipes or thin air that they transmit on exclusive rights. That's called licensing. They'll shut down. They'll have to shut them down eventually. It's using electricity, downstairs at each site. Less and less people will have those devices, and so the people that are stuck with the old handsets, they might be just like people that only have GSM phones now. They won't have a service unless they upgrade, basically. So you'll be kind of forced to upgrade as well.
Wow,
in that regard. Now, I'll just mention 3G uses. So Telstra uses 850 megahertz, just below 1 gig, roughly. And then they also do use other bands higher for capacity. So usually they use the lower bands for that's how you get on the network because it goes the furthest. And then it might shuffle you up into one of the higher bands. So your phone will have it can talk to multiple frequencies. Initially, 3G phones could only talk to one frequency at a time. So you might get shuffled up it goes all the way from 850 to 2.1 gigahertz. The 3G networks were still up in that lower 1 to 2 gig. So, they were, and 4G uses those same sort of that area as well. The telco industry will tell you that 4G is more efficient in terms of power and transmission because they try and make, the phone does so much these days. It has to save battery as much as possible. From their perspective, in terms of health, it's probably, and power levels, 4G is actually more efficient and uses less power in both ways. Now, you might say then, but the waveform looks different. Now, they don't address that at all. In 5G, the waveform is even more different because it's more bits onto the wavelength, of the actual wavelength. So I'll just mention also the base station end. You'll see, there'll be panel antennas, but what they want to release is, so MIMO is the key word. Multiple in, multiple out, having multiple transmitters. Your handset will have multiple antennas inside it too. It already does, but they're very small and they're not that, there's only so many you can fit in there. They're usually at the bottom, by the way, where when you're talking to your phone. At the very bottom of your phone where the microphone is, to get it away from your head, so to meet the SAR requirements as best as possible. Do you see people walk around with they put the phone on speaker mode and then they have the bottom part closest to their head anyway. So it's kind of defeats the purpose. But on the base station end, they'll look the same. Internally, they'll actually be, because once they start going towards these high frequencies, they'll have arrays inside. So they'll be like miniature antennas inside that big panel antenna. And that enables basically multiple antennas connecting to your device at these high frequencies. So they're going to be called antenna arrays. So currently you have 4 to 8 antennas on a base station. Later on, they'll be using the higher frequencies, smaller wavelength. So you'll be able to cram 64 to 128 antennas in that one little footprint because they're much smaller antennas. So the aperture only has to be millimeters, not centimeters, hundreds of centimeters small. So in a way, the current band is actually centimetric wave. It's just called microwave. But the whole prefix of microwave is kind of a misnomer too. It's not. It's kind of just a label. At the end of the day, they all have heating effects, and that's the effect.
We'll get to that in a minute.
With 5G, I'll just mention, so more antennas on the base station end, and much more antennas. They're going to be a lot smaller. They're going to look about the same visually, but there'll be more antennas. And the networks are going to be denser because you'll have the wider network, and then you'll have also the small cells that are covering.
All right, so you've got these big monster base cells, which we've got now. They're going to probably use the same ones just because it saves getting approvals. And then
they'll use the same footprint. So what they'll swap out the antenna itself. Internally, it'll be different.
But no approvals are required, right? Because the tower is already there.
As long as they meet the visual, so they're not. Hasn't grown in volume or size, or there's certain in the legislation there's certain heights you can low impact versus high, that's just purely visual amenity. So how it looks. So generally the telcos try and swap out old antennas for new ones. Inside they're more densely packed because that's just.
So that's the big base stations, and then we're going to have all these little small cells put on. Are they going to be retrofitted on lamp posts or street lights?
Yeah, so it'll be whatever your local, so wherever you are in the world, whatever your local telco can get an agreement with, whoever they can agreement with. I'd say it'd be a lot easier to put it on light poles than power poles, because power poles, you have electricity, right below.
Yeah.
A lot of the power authorities don't like having antennas above the electricity. Because then they want their workers to do any sort of maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want telco workers going up there. Power poles get more problematic for the telcos. Otherwise, they're forced to mount further lower, and they don't want to do that because you want to be at the top of the structure. So generally, light poles will be the main go-to for. They'll have agreements with councils, with whoever owns the light poles, and they'll just look like little floppy antennas. Some of them look like little panels. It'll just depend. The panels generally are directional antennas.
Some providers will actually build their own lamp posts, just like Verizon's doing in Sacramento.
Yeah, so they're called smart light poles. So, and they'll sell that to councils basically, or whoever installs light poles, where it'll be ready to go. They'll have antennas inside them. So next time the council goes through and updates light poles, or a new area is built, a new suburb, instead of buying the old light poles, we'll buy the smart ones now that have antennas, LED lighting, whatever, built in automatically. So they're a bit more advanced. Then telcos can just come along and plug in. They don't have to worry about climbing it and putting an antenna up. So that'll happen too.
And can you talk about beam forming?
Yeah, so massive MIMO, a critical part of massive MIMO is beam forming. And when you have multiple antennas, so out of the antenna, there's a pattern that comes out of it. So a directional antenna, has a certain pattern that it radiates towards and fills out the space. And it's kind of like currently it's kind of like a hose that's just kind of doing a blanket coverage using MIMO, massive MIMO, and these multiple little antennas inside. Through signal processing and other techniques, they'll be able to sort of narrow that pattern and tailor it to each device.
So like a rifle would shoot a bullet.
Basically, yeah. So they're almost like, currently antennas are steerable up and down, but there's just like this kind of like a blob coverage. Now each antenna will be able to transmit sort of more pointed pattern towards each device.
So if I don't have a device, then I can't get shot by the bullet.
Yeah, because that's your device will be talking to it basically, yeah.
But if I don't have a device, then they can't shoot me. Is that right?
I guess so.
And everyone else has got a device, then I'm going to get caught in the crossfire. But
yeah, if you want to look at it that way, but it's all about focusing this RF energy in specific directions, and so you enable, you're kind of tailoring and then the person has their own, almost like a dedicated link to the base station. Currently, it's kind of plucks out its data stream out of the whole blanket coverage. So in a way, it's more efficient because it's not blanket coverage. It's just specific to whoever wants it. The only thing, and so you could argue, and the industry probably will argue, that it's now more tailored. It's not so indiscriminate. It's now focused on each device. The thing is, though, there'll be a lot more devices. So the power levels, I don't know. So there's probably a trade-off there where it's like, they're saying the 5G is going to be a lot more energy efficient, because at the end of the day, if you have more data transmission, more devices, both yours in the pocket and also every bin, light pole, or IoT, you need efficiency, because otherwise electricity use is going to be vast. So they argue that through these advanced methods like beamforming and MIMO, the power levels will be a lot smaller to each device. And so overall, the increase in power levels throughout the community are going to be marginal. And I think that's currently the argument from the industry.
So what's the spacing going to be? Just call it suburbia, not the city. Let's go out to the suburbs. Like, is it going to be every second lamp post, or is it going to be...
So it really depends on what frequency they ultimately use. Hundreds of meters, basically. Hundreds of meters, yeah. 50 meters to 100 meters and then depending, obviously, the engineers themselves that work in this is the smart part of it. They'll decide, they buy the equipment. That's the dumb part. We've just bought the equipment. Now, how do we get it out there? And now this is where the smart part of the telcos is. They just work out exactly to maximize coverage, how we're going to place it, given, the obstructions and the buildings and the layout of the land.
This rule of thumb, 50 to 200 meters, we're going to have to put another cell in.
That's right. It's very hard in the wireless world to give exact, because it's all, every area, it's so different. As opposed to laying a cable, it's guaranteed. Wireless channel is never guaranteed.
And that's a lot of cells. How long is it going to take for, you guys and all your merry mates to put these up?
It depends. It really depends on what kind of agreements are drawn up. So between, say, when the telcos draw up agreements with power companies, because currently they don't have like a blanket agreement with anyone. It's all individual. So they'll want to stitch those up. When that happens, then it's probably a relatively fast rollout, I guess. A bit like, no, maybe not like the NBN, but...
So all the agreements are done the end of this year. So everyone knows what standards we're using. I saw the 3G PPP came out with, some standards around 3.5 megahertz and I think 50 gigahertz for the high frequency bandwidth, but it's going to vary. That all gets settled down.
Yeah, it's now in the process of being kind of worked out.
October, I've been told, is the preliminary kind of time frame this year where they're going to make a decision.
Yeah.
Give or take, who knows?
Well, the 3GPP, I've just got a thing here. They're starting full-scale trials and commercial deployments as early as 2019. So this is they're calling it 5G NR, new radio, basically. That's what it stands for. That's kind of the standard that all the companies internationally and the bodies have kind of agreed upon. This is what we're going to go with, and the vendors themselves. And so now they can kick off. So this has only been agreed upon now.
So we'll give them a year. So we're now talking the beginning of 2019. The rollout begins. And it could be 2020, but I just want to start somewhere. Will it take you... So Australia's only got 25 million people, but it's spread out over a country nearly the size of the US.
It's a lot harder. So Australia's definitely a lot harder for telecommunications because if you put you roll out a fibre optic cable, at the end of it, in South Korea you have hundreds of people. In Australia you could roll out a fibre optic cable for hundreds and hundreds of
people. You have a kangaroo.
And at the end of it you have two guys and a kangaroo. So in terms of density, Australia's actually quite. It's very tough. And
okay, so let's talk about cities. So you've got Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane. Like we've got the big cities.
Yep.
Your target. When I say you, the telecommunications companies will target the big cities first because that's where more money's going to be made.
That's right, yeah. That's how it always works. So all the generations you find, it's always the densest that get this. And what you'll find with these massive MIMO with 5G, these dense antenna arrays will be happening where the population density is. You'll start in the CBD and then roll out through the suburbs. Where the users are, essentially, that's what the telcos do. They go where the users are. Eventually, in stadiums, public kind of places where there's a lot of people, that's where you'll see these dense antenna arrays occur, and small cells. In the outer burbs, they'll get them later, and then out in the remote, it'll be even later.
So just give a time frame. Like, is it? So we say, okay, we start whatever date it is. Let's say it's 2019. In the first year, you'll have most of the Sydney kind of CBD done, right?
They usually take about a year to year and a half, 1 to 2 years, usually a year and a half, I think, based on experience of the 4G rollout, where the CBD and the major metro areas kind of done, mostly.
Okay, so 1 year for the CBD, 2 years for the major metros.
Yeah.
And they'll do every city.
Roughly. This is all really rough,
I'm not going to hold you to it. Jim, I'm not going to hold you to it.
It depends on the telco too, and what kind of funding they have. Because at the end of the day, all this costs money too, and if they can secure funding, how the industry, if the market crashes, for example, they might slow it down.
I don't think so. I think they'll speed it up.
The share prices drop. There's all that kind of stuff too, where then they pull back the technology a little bit, the rollout, because if there's not enough money, then. So, I mean, if you're praying for this to slow down, you probably want to pray for a market crash. I don't know.
I don't think it's going to slow down. In fact, I think it's going to increase because more and more people are waking up and they've got to get it rolled out before people like EMF warriors to kick up a stink and stop it.
I've got a note here actually, that I saw from one of the industry bodies that it has been estimated that there will be in the region of 10 small cells per the base station, the one you see currently. So for each tower that you see in your area, which covers the 3 kilometers, you'll have roughly about 10 small cells. That's kind of in these dense urban areas, potentially more in the CBD, like especially when you get towards
the high buildings. And all that.
High buildings and all that, even more.
All right, so we've got 1 to 2 years for rollout from the day it starts for the major cities into suburbia, and then probably, X years to get out to the remote areas. And some of the remote areas won't even get 5G, right? Because it's expensive.
So this is the thing. They probably won't have small cells. They might, in a remote town, they might put a small cell in the middle of town, and that just covers the small,
like the post office and the pub. And
basically. The farmers themselves, most likely not. They'll have to pretty much... They'll have 4G, 3G or 4G for quite a while, providing that sort of wider coverage. Eventually, those base stations will get updated to 5G. That'll take years. They'll be a lot later down the track. So, if you're someone that's concerned about 5G and the emissions and all that, really, it's the name of the game is remote.
We'll talk about that. I want to talk about. We are going to have. This is a long podcast, people. We may split it into 2 episodes. I'll let Scott and the other guys decide how they want to do that. But there's a couple more technical questions that I want to get to just to keep our engineers happy because they're going to kill me if I don't ask them. The power outputs of the antennas.
Yep.
of 5G antennas. Do you know what they are? And you don't know the frequencies and bandwidths because that hasn't been worked out yet.
What you'll find is, if you have access to, and it's publicly available information, the RFNSA, the Radio Frequency National Site Archive, that if you use oztowers.com.au, that actually draws data from that. So anyone can log into this and see where the nearest tower is and what's deployed on that tower. Port powers, I'm not sure if you'd have to have industry access, or you can get it if you pursue it enough, because they don't really try and hide this. So really, all the telcos know exactly what their competitors have deployed. And in this database, they have to put in the port powers on each port of each antenna, because that's EME report gets produced out of that. So that's the safety report for that's available to the community for every site. So none of this is kind of hidden. And what you'll find is for 4G, the equivalent 5G antennas that get put up, those panel type looking ones, won't be that different in terms of port powers. They'll be very similar.
Some of the more important questions that I've got is, what rules do you have about installing these, let's call them the motherships, the big base station towers around schools and daycare and kind of highly sensitive populations? Do you have any rules, or you just put them wherever you think?
So what happens is, with the telcos, there's actually in the actual legislation, as far as I'm aware, because as long as they are below the public exposure limit, they can put them anywhere. That's kind of the general rule. Now, councils, local...
And they do, right? Because there's lots of towers next to schools.
Because at the end of the day, they view this as, here's the standard. It's set by an international body. And the main one is that International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, ICNIRP.
Let's get to that in a minute. I just want to talk about locations.
Yep.
So really, as long as they're below the limit, they can go wherever they want. That's
exactly. So now, to keep the community more happier, because there's probably enough people that are concerned about having them nearby.
Not enough. Don't worry. We want a lot more.
Yeah. So the different governments will have different meter distance, so they mandate the telcos, and they basically tell the telcos, we won't approve a base station if it's within, say, 200 meters of a childcare center, a school, or a TAFE campus. Usually, there's young people, essentially. Different state governments have different buffer zones. Now, there's actually, I don't think it's illegal. If the telcos took them to court, the telcos would win, basically, because the courts only look at what is the standard. What have the international bodies determined as the safety standard? And that's the law. Now, the telcos don't do that because it's public, like PR-wise, it looks bad. So they generally do follow those, because they're not a standard. They're kind of like a guideline, a recommendation by the government based on community concern to stay away from these certain areas.
So just getting back to the rural areas, at the moment, a lot of transmission's done via satellite to satellite dishes, and then they're put into the homes.
So there is still communities in Australia that do not have mobile phone coverage at all because they're too remote. And eventually they'll get it. The fibre footprint gets pushed, as it travels along the major highways, and it gets extended out. So there's another refuge if you find towns that are that remote, but most people don't live out there.
The farmer's house would get a satellite for the data for his internet. And
if he's not within an area of mobile coverage, so there is, out remote, that's where they put towers on top of big hills, and they produce more power because they'll still meet the current standards because they're far away from anyone, and it's kind of like an umbrella footprint kind of thing that goes 50 kilometers or whatever, 40, 50, and covers much wider area. There's a lot less users, so there's all that.
But there won't be 5G because it can't travel that far, right? So
no, so 5G, the technology itself can be put on any band, basically, just like 4G can, and 3G. Okay. It's all to do with the actual physics of transmitting at different bands. If 5G is put in below 1 gig, so say they replace the 4G at 700 megahertz that's currently being used, that's the waterfront estate of radio transmission, because it goes the furthest. It's the sweet antennas aren't too
sweet spot. You guys love that, I know.
Yeah, so that one, if 5G gets put onto that, then it'll propagate as far as 4G and 3G does. It'll go as far as that.
So you can still sell those, send those millimetre wave packets of information on the mid frequency.
Well, no. So they're now centimetre waves.
That's what I thought. That's what I'm getting confused. So,
yeah, no. So the millimetre waves is purely the wavelength size.
Gotcha. So that's got nothing to do with the generation. That's just the way it's delivered.
Yeah. That's just the way the actual physical properties of the electromagnetic wave itself. that travels through the air.
So they could send 5G over satellites then if they wanted.
It can be sent over anything because it's really, when I mentioned the air interface and the way you multiplex the data streams through the air, basically, that is the difference between all the generations. And the actual physical properties that transmit it, the radio carrier wave, different bands, that'll carry it, that'll work on all the generations, basically.
Right, and you see 5G being the kind of backbone of all transmission in 5 years or more. That'll just be the standard as we just...
Well, it'll be the standard between the device, be it a machine or a robot or your mobile phone, to some transmitter, usually owned by the telco. Behind the antenna into the cloud network, the greater cloud, it's not 5G technically. It's whatever transmission standards they use for the cable network, which is fiber optic, dense wave division multiplexing. There's a whole bunch of different ones that are, carrying huge amounts of data on light. That's what fiber optic is. The 5G is really the radio part of the network. Behind the antenna, there is the 5G network itself, which is kind of like just the way it's structured, all the data transmission. But then, really it's the air interface. That's really the difference between all the generations. I think that's where people get confused.
Yeah, I could see that. So let's go into the future a little bit. I've heard people talk about 5G being beamed up from footpaths as you walk along down a busy urban or city street.
Yeah.
Can you talk about some of the kind of unusual things we can expect moving down?
So once again, we're back to just the physics of transmitting up in the higher bands, the millimetric wave bands. Yeah. As opposed to, the current bands are, the wavelength is in the centimetres range. So, in a way, if you were to actually accurately call this stuff, currently we use centimetric waves, and now we're going to be starting to use millimetric waves because they're just the wavelength smaller. That's all it is. And, if you go right down to sonar, we're talking kilometre long waves or, hundreds of meters or whatever, depending on where you are. So that's all it is. It's just a measurement of the wavelength up there in these higher bands. That's the reason you employ small cells. Now, we mentioned before about putting up on light poles, and say you're transmitting at 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 gigahertz. As you go up in those bands, it can, at 60 gig, it's a very short range, and it gets blocked by skin. It gets blocked by atmospheric conditions. If it rains, it definitely, moisture in the air will block it. So it's all about very short distances. So they need to find nifty ways to put antennas. The benefit is up higher, you can make very small antennas because the wavelength's very small. Sneak them into things, basically. And you still want to meet to the current standard, emission standards and exposure standards. So they, everything's up for grabs. Where can you put them into? You can put them into potentially into like pavement on the ground, transmitting up, from below. As long as it's meeting all the current emission standards, it's fine. It'll be approved. You can potentially replace manholes and have them, instead of the metal, you make them something else. I don't know, some sort of advanced plastic or whatever. I'm speculating on that regard. But where you can put antennas, and as you go up high in the bands, that's this benefit, quote unquote. You can have much smaller antennas and you can kind of sneak them into places, anything you can imagine, basically. The other thing is if they're smaller and they're closer to you, they can transmit at very low power because they're only having to go, say even 5 meters, 10 meters, and then you duck around the corner, another one's already picked you up. So if there's a whole dense distribution of antennas right throughout, say, a CBD area, you're walking along, you're talking to one of them, 10 minutes later, you hand off to the next one, 10 minutes later, you hand off to the next one, or if you're talking about massive MIMO, you're connected to 5 of them at the same time. And that's a data stream coming from each one. And that's how you get these huge gigabit speeds because it's a data stream, there's multiple data streams transmitting at you. And you're getting huge speeds as a result.
So they're going to sneak into our homes as well. And they've already started a lot of confusion with the new Wi-Fi's that used to just use 2.4. You wanted to say something before we go to the house?
I was going to say, so 5G will come the air interface standard, basically. What travels through the air, 5G will be the dominant thing, accommodating way more devices. And of course, that'll make its way into the home. Now, into the home will be voluntary, obviously. So people... In a
router, or they just put it in a modem or a router?
Well, it'd be routers, like in your office. There'll be other devices that get sold that connect to 5G and can also transmit 5G. Consumer devices of all sorts. You could potentially maybe buy a hotspot that sits in a fridge. I saw an ad by Samsung where they said now the fridge now is going to be the central thing of your house. It's a big thing. It's got its own power supply. You could put a computer almost into it. It's got a panel, so you could really retrofit it with a big television looking thing. It could be a hotspot, all that kind of stuff. The sky's the limit. The imagination is the limit of all of these for these companies.
So just to summarise where we're going, we're moving into an atmosphere that's going to be saturated with millimetre waves longer term.
Centimetre and millimetre waves, yes. So the current radio bands plus up higher. These, so we're talking what they call, currently we kind of use, VHF, very high frequency, UHF. These are just labels basically, because when they first started using these bands back in the 60s, whatever it was earlier, they were like, oh, that's a very high frequency, and we'll call it VHF. Now we're opening up the next one up. Well, we'll call it ultra high, UHF, and then SHF, super high. So we're now going into that 6 gig to 100 gig.
So Jim, we've done a lot of coverage of the technology, and I want to move into health. And the best way to move into health is talk about the standards.
Yeah.
Now, Australia, the US, most of the Anglo-American countries currently run their RF microwave exposure guidelines around 1,000, not around, exactly 1,000 microwatts per square centimetre. Now, most people listening will know that's based on a thermal standard. So the government and the industries, stacked health committees, and that's a fact, whether people want to admit that or not, is based everything on, if it doesn't cause a heat issue, it can't cause damage, because they need the thermal stimulation to break a DNA bond. And they've based all their standards on that for 20, 30 years, even though there is a multitude of researchers, literally tens of thousands of papers, dating all the way back to the 60s and 70s, which clearly showed biological impact of these frequencies at very, very, very low levels, much, much lower than the current standards. It's been a great cover-up by government, an even better cover-up by industry, and they're really sneaky. And one of the things I want to mention to the audience is, I think it's called ICNIRP, the International Commission for Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, which is the policy group sitting under the World Health Organization, which is setting these so-called safety limits. They're so sneaky. You know what they've done now? They're going to classify skin as a limb or a hand or a foot, not as a head or a vital organ, because these millimetre waves we've been talking about don't penetrate very deep into the human body. They're kind of going to hit your skin and your eyes and things like that, which is really bad. But they don't want to meet the higher sensitive standards you have for your brain and for vital organs.
That's what they're arguing. So, like in these the current things that we use, the radio waves that we use, penetrate, they go through solids, they go through human bodies. So that's the standard they currently have for 6 gigahertz and below. As soon as you go up higher, like I said before, it gets blocked by moisture in the air, anything solid, and same with human body if it hits. So in a way also when you hold the device, your hand will obstruct, that kind of stuff. So these are all design things that they have to consider. The standards themselves, they're basically saying it doesn't penetrate the body, so it's only the skin that we have to worry about. Now, those standards are actually being developed right now as well for human exposure, 5G.
They are. And my question to the telcos, if you can answer on their behalf, is there's lots of countries have much lower standards already. Like we know even China, Russia, like the BRICS country, India, have around 10 microwatts per square centimetre. And we get into some of the European countries like Austria and Bulgaria and Belgium. They're all down to 0.11 microwatt per square centimetre. So my question to the telcos would be, if you get told you have to go down to 0.1, how are you going to achieve that with your current infrastructure?
Yeah. So, the first question is, why do those countries why is there such differences? Most of the West sticks to the key major body that everyone pretty much sets their standards to is that what you mentioned, that ICNIRP, International Commission of Non-Ionizing Radiation. So these guys look at the non-ionizing radiation. That's, radio waves, microwaves, everything up to the visible spectrum, basically. And then that's non-ionizing radiation. Ionizing radiation is ultraviolet, UVB, I think it was, X-rays, gamma rays, cosmic rays, the terahertz kind of stuff. That part of the spectrum ionizes atoms and molecules, so it knocks electrons out of them and breaks chemical bonds. So that's basically the nuclear industry. That's considered extremely harmful for health. Everything below that is non-ionizing, and it's so it's there's only thermal effects that are recognized. So this international body, that's what everyone, most of the countries subscribe to. Whatever they say, they'll go with. There's the World Health Organization too. This the ICNIP is actually it's independent body, so it's not non-governmental. It's not UN or anything, but it's just supposed experts that all gathered together for the purposes of setting standards. And seemingly we all follow that. Now, why these other countries have lower standards? It's a good question. The West basically says these limits have been determined on the basis of established health effects, and they include safety margins based on the studies that we have up to now, and that's all they recognize. So if these other countries are having lower limits, that's up to them. They'll probably argue that it's political pressure, but it's not based on the current research. We only stick to the current research.
Which is totally incorrect.
Yeah.
That's just outrageous. For anyone who actually studied this properly, like I have, and many of the people listening to this podcast, just listen to the podcast we did with the #1 EMF researcher in the world, who's Dr. Andrew Marino. He's published thousands of papers, I think written 3 or 4 books, a couple more coming out soon, worked with the godfather of electromagnetic fields, which is Dr. Robert O'Becker. They've proven this way back in the 60s, 70s and 80s. Then industry came along and said, no, we're going to use these frequencies, so let's bodge these studies by changing the study design. So the study's done properly, so it could always be published, but it's designed in a way to give them the results they want. Then they stack all these so-called industry committees and influence the World Health Organization and other health authorities. Then they bribe the politicians to make sure there's no legislation passed, and it's just been a complete cover-up. So, I understand why these other countries have got lower levels, because Russia and all those Eastern European countries have known about these effects way, way, way back, and they're much more into bioenergy-related medicine and things than we are. Now, I understand that telcos are going to say, well, hang on, this is what the government says, it's not our fault. We're just meeting the government standard. My question to you, and we'll talk about the telcos in a minute, my question to you as a technician, can we take the existing infrastructure with the planned 5G millimetre waves and actually get our exposure limits down to the 0.1 microwatt per square centimetre, or is that technically impossible?
First of all, I'll just mention first that this ICNRP is actually reviewing the current standards. And so I think it was supposed to be released in end of 2016, but now maybe this year it's coming out. I haven't seen enough. Now,
the same with the NDP rat study. Those results have been known for a number of years. They released a part of it, and they're delaying that because they don't want it to come out, because the 2G, the second generation technology they use in those studies is now outdated, but even that showed significant problems with different issues in rats.
So I'll just say that they are reviewing them now, where we're using in the West, and now it's just a question of how much and it's not going to be revised up. It's going to be revised down. Now it's just a matter of how far down. And I think what's expected in the industry that it's going to be maybe halved. So it's probably not nowhere near, or 40% to, about a half of what they currently are. And they have looked at the GSMA, which is the Global Industry Association. They kind of asked vendors around the world how much would it impact them and their compliance if this gets halved. So the limit that you mentioned, is it in line with the Bioinitiative report?
Yeah, well, the Bioinitiative set their limit at 0.0003.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
So I'm not going that low because I know you could never meet that. I'm just saying...
Basically, that would be shutting down everything.
That's what I thought. But can we get down to 1 or get down to 10? Or are we stuck at, you're saying now 500 is about as low as you can get with the existing infrastructure?
Well, so this ICNRP is going to halve it potentially, the current standard.
Right, so from 1,000 to 500.
Yeah, roughly. Depending on the frequency, like in Australia, there's if you go from 10 megahertz all the way up to like 1,000, so a gig, it does change the levels. They're lower at these lower bands, and they have more fat basically at these high bands. But they're roughly at the level that you mentioned. So it's in Australia, for example, the 900 megahertz is 4.5 watts per square meter. That's the current. And this is where the 2G, 3G network currently sits, and 4G as well, using those sort of bands. So it's about 4 watts per square meter, roughly. So in this global impact assessment that this industry body did, they asked a whole bunch of telcos, and how would that impact their compliance? And what they said is no impact. About 84% there'd be no impacts to what they've currently deployed around the world. A normal upgrade, so they'd have to do some upgrades. About 4% said they would do that. Significant engineering, so that now becomes significant down powering, changing antennas around, about 8%. And then relocating sites. So that's probably the most expensive option, where you actually relocate sites further away or to meet the compliance. About 4% said that. So literally the overwhelming majority said what they currently have deployed, they sat down and worked out and said the halving it is not going to do anything. Not doing anything. We won't have to do anything significant, change our network around too much. Now, you're talking about 100 times less, is that what you're saying? The limit? When you're talking about 100 times less, that becomes a problem. So it would probably still be, I don't know if it would be doable, but what would happen? Well, depending on how far they revise it, they won't go that as far as you're saying, I guess.
So my question, if they don't, how do these other countries provide the same service at those low levels and we can't do it? I don't understand that.
So depending on the country, so I'm assuming probably like user density, they're also deploying older networks too. China, now...
China's 10.
Because it does change depending on the frequency. So this 800 to 900 megahertz, which is currently what 3G and 4G is using. So the UK, Canada, US, and Australia are using about 5.8 watts. So 5.8 watts per square meter. So China's at about much less. So we're like, yeah, which is interesting. I don't know how they're deploying, because they are definitely deploying mobile networks en masse.
For me, it's just cost. It's going to cost more to do it, at a lower level, and we couldn't be bothered paying the money.
I just can't comment on how they're doing it. I don't know.
There's so much evidence now. I got all the original papers, right? I just didn't read other people's books. I went and got all these papers and I read them because I couldn't believe what I read.
Yeah.
There's no way this could be happening. And I got so cranky and so upset, particularly when they tried to gag me. I went, that's it. We'll start EMF warriors and we'll really cause a storm. And that's what we're doing, because we want to give the other side of the story that's been hidden away.
So I'd be asked the question back then, if the evidence is now coming out and it's overwhelming, as you say, and has been, and whatever's happened, I'm not across that, but surely there will be appetite for change, even for the people that in these standards bodies, because at the telco level, literally people just believe.
But you've got to understand how the standard committees are put together.
Yeah. So, but the thing is, though, for me though personally, like if they know something that everyone, and they're hiding it, because they live in this, them and their families and everyone they know, like they can't really get away from this either. So if they're allowing these very generous, if they are very generous, these standards, they themselves are swimming in that ocean of IRF as well, and so is everyone else around.
But they want to believe...
Are they just being suicidal in a way? Or...
No, they just want to believe the other studies that have been done by industry, which show it's not an issue. And they go, well, there's half the studies say there is a problem, half the studies say there isn't a problem. They don't realise who's funding those studies. And really, if you actually went to researchers like Henry Lay, which show 3/4 of the studies done by industry show there isn't a problem, and the vice versa with the ones funded without industry money. Like they don't go into that level of detail, and it's kind of kept away. And there's only fringe groups like, the people who are getting sick are speaking out and doing this research, and we're pretty smart. We're not the average people. We're company directors, we're top level scientists, where there's lawyers and there's other people coming along who are just fighting back because they're getting sick, their kids are getting brain tumours, and they're working out that, hang on a sec, this all relates back to research that clearly shows an association, and it's overwhelming, the evidence. Where does liability lie is interesting, and you and I had...
It gets fuzzier. And with the legal, it gets a lot fuzzier. It's not so...
It's going to be difficult, because that example we talked about over dinner where you said, well, hang on a sec, we're just the tobacconists. We are providing the product to the public who desperately want to smoke. And we went through and said, okay, so it's the Qualcomm and the chip manufacturers that kind of make the seeds and they genetically modify them to make them better. They give them to Nokia and Ericsson, which are the guys who turn the tobacco into cigarettes and they put the filters on and wrap it in paper. They give them to you, well, not you, but give them to the telcos, and they package it. They put them in the cardboard box and they make sure they look pretty. And then they provide it to the consumer, who's the one who really wants them. No one's at fault because the government's saying all these standards are being met. Whether those standards are accurate or not is a debate we just went around in circles on. And this whole tobacco analogy is really interesting because passive smoking is really what we're getting affected by. So if I don't want to have a device, I don't want to smoke, that's okay. But all the ads I see on television today is all about how to teach your kids how to smoke. Yeah. So it's all about, all these apps you can do with your kids. And
so currently it's not seen as tobacco for most people, especially for the, in the general, a lot of people. And also in the industry itself, they're just like, well, it's harmful at a certain level, at a very high level.
Yeah, only if you put it onto your skin and burn yourself, it's only a problem there.
And to say that research that proves, say, that it is more harmful than is a thermal effect gets out, and the standards bodies actually adjust the standards down, revise it down, and then the workers themselves will go, well, I guess they'll now become like tobacco workers. Well, they'll go, well, I know it's more harmful than I thought it was before. I'm still going to work in industry because a bit like the current guy that works in the tobacco factory. He knows it's what he's selling is harmful, but if people want it, he's obviously going to keep working. And
it's a legal product. He's just not going to smoke around his kids.
Maybe. So maybe that's what changes in the future. I don't know if that's what emerges. Obviously, that's the battle there. And really, ultimately, for things to change is for those standards.
So let's get on to what we're going to do to try and minimise our exposure. And, I've been asked to give a presentation to a conference, and whether I do it or not, I'm not sure. But the title of my talk would be it's on 5G. The best result for 5G is we all get sick. Because I don't see any change coming anywhere until everyone starts getting these skin cancers, start getting these retina problems, start getting all these other diseases. And eventually they're going to realise it isn't genetics. It isn't, some pesticide. It isn't all these other things that could be a problem. It is actually these frequencies, these artificial frequencies that our body have never been exposed to, for at least millions of years. It's only the last 100 years and really only the last few decades that we're getting hit with them. Is the actual cause of these underlying issues that we face. That's what I think it's going to take, and that's going to take a number of years. How many? I don't know, but that's personally my position. I hope I'm wrong and people wake up quicker, but I think we're going to see an onslaught, according to the doctors I listen to, of disease rolling out at epidemic levels. If you say it's going to be out in 2021, then probably a couple of years after that, we're going to see these diseases get out of control. They're already out of control, but I mean at levels where every second person's getting them. So unfortunately, I'm not going to be one of those people, and neither are you, I'm sure, and neither are the listeners. So let's go through, and I'm going to ask you first, what are you going to do to protect yourself and your family from these frequencies, particularly the onslaught of these small cells and 5G?
What I'll comment on is it depends on where you sit on what you believe in currently, what evidence you want to subscribe to. The network itself is getting closer to the user. Your greatest exposure ultimately is also from the device in your pocket, because that distance is a critical part of this. So if you're someone that's concerned about exposure, really your device is the number one source of all your exposure, because it's just that distance is right there. Every doubling of distance, it's a 75% reduction in power, roughly, inverse square law. First step, if you're really concerned, you get that device away from you, or use it less, or whatever it is.
Don't buy it is my recommendation. Just do not have it in the house.
Don't buy it. And then the next step is if you're then concerned about the network coming closer and small cells, then it, once again, distance. So like I said, the rollout's more in CBDs first, and then eventually suburbs. So depending on your level of concern, I'd say just from talking to most people in the community, and it's quite low.
It's very low.
So therefore, most people won't move. The ones that are concerned, depending on what level of concern, you'll either, in financial ability, you'll go out of suburbs, or you might go right in the country, or you might go to those radio quiet areas where they have those telescopes that need radio silence to operate.
So here's what I'm doing. I live in the city of Sydney, so I'm in the sewer. I'm looking, buying an apartment in an area which is close to the ocean and close to the harbour, so I don't have too many neighbours, in a very well-structured building, which is mainly concrete, because concrete is a great way to block signals. I will have 0 devices or very few devices in the house itself or in the apartment itself. And then I'm probably going to buy a farm in a area which is known to be almost dead. There's a low population, say 2,000 people in the whole Council Shire area, which is a big space in Australia, that has good access back to the city. And I'm going to use that as the fun farm for my extended family to get as many breaks as they can out of what I call the non-native EMF sewer in which they live.
And I'll just mention, so what you're talking about there is getting away from the network itself, not just the devices. And what drives network expansion is users. So even people that, there's instances of communities that some communities don't care when a tower pops up. Others are quite, they'll get militant. They'll say, we don't want this here, won't even near us. Problem is that telco that's putting that tower in is doing it because there is demand. So either, generally the coverage is already there, it's usually capacity. So a lot of that's the kind of the irony of the situation too. In some of these is the people in that area are using the data, especially data these days. So they are driving the traffic growth because these sites cost money, hundreds of thousands, potentially into the millions, depending on how to build, where it's going to be built, how it's going to be built, what's going to be deployed.
Well, they're going to have return on investment. Okay.
And they're going to have return on investment. So they're definitely not going to deploy the latest, greatest, best, with huge amounts of capacity out in the middle of nowhere where there's 2 users.
Is there anything else that you suggest people can do to minimize exposure to both?
And really, distance is king. That's your absorption ratio, the absorption rate that you get from your device and also from the network itself. It's that distance. Now, if you're going to live in the cities, there is also, your phone does power up if you're further away. So good coverage areas actually ensure your phone doesn't transmit at a much higher level. So there's a whole bunch of trade-offs. There's never a clear kind of, and then it's just a matter of how concerned are you.
I can tell you, our members, who especially those with the sensitive to electromagnetic fields, are very concerned. I'm going to wind this up, Jim. We actually got through it without throwing too many punches at each other, so I'm really happy about that.
No worries.
I'm just going to finish with one more thing for the EMF warriors listening, and they know this already, but I just want to ram it home. You've got to build your own resiliency, your biological resiliency, and the best way to do that is by reconnecting back to nature. You've really got to go back to those natural frequencies that for millions of years our human body has grown up with and developed and evolved with, and that is AM sunrise is the number one frequency everyone should be going for. Barefoot, so we get the grounding effects, and as some UV in the middle of the day without getting burnt is really important. Then you need to look at mitigating your house, particularly your sleep areas, because that's when you're going to recover and your body rejuvenates at night when you're sleeping. So we need to really focus on building our resiliency. That's critical as we move into this 5G crazy world we're developing. Thanks for listening. Jim, thanks for coming on. I know it's a big subject. We needed to get it out there. We've done it, and I thank you so much.
No worries. Thank you.
Thank you for being part of the EMF Warriors community. We look forward to bringing you our next episode. Be certain to join in discussions on our EMF Warriors closed Facebook group. And to make sure you subscribe to our fortnightly newsletter to stay up to date with global developments. If you would like to learn more about us, go to emfwarriors.com, where we have curated an amazing library of free information, resources, and solutions to your most pressing EMF concerns and needs. Because together we can make a real difference. The materials and content discussed within this podcast are the opinions of host Jason Bawden-Smith and Scott Compton and guest interviews. This information is intended as general information only for listeners of this podcast. Listeners should always seek professional advice, and the content and opinions expressed in this podcast should never be construed as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. EMF Warriors.